Democrat delegates are saying today they're ready to fight for Kamala Harris with renewed vigor. Tonight, Emily Byer brings us both sides.
Two local Democratic delegates saying today Vice President Kamala Harris is the best candidate to take on former President Donald Trump this November. At a press conference today, Green Bay State Assembly candidates Ahmad Riviera Wagner and Christy Welch talked about Trump and Harris's differences. Harris, a former DA and prosecutor, and Trump's recent felony convictions. Democrats also referencing Project 2025, which was published by the Heritage Foundation, calling it extreme.
This was the blueprint decided and designed by at least 140 people in the Trump administration, at least 6 of which were either former deputies or secretaries themselves. This was the blueprint that they imagined for a second term in the Trump administration. What we learned both from the 4 years he was president and the 4 years after and this plan for the next 4 years is that most Americans do not like extremist policies that turn back the time on rights, privileges, and our future.
Wisconsin GOP spokesperson Matt Fisher issuing a statement in response saying, quote, "No campaign reboot or rebranding exercise will distract voters away from Kamala Harris's extremist agenda of decriminalizing border crossings, banning all private and union-provided health insurance, and slashing funding for law enforcement. Voters know Republicans are ready to deliver real change this November with peace, prosperity, and security for all." Harris and Trump both continuing to make stops across the U.S. Donald Trump wrapping up a stop in North Carolina. Kamala Harris adding Georgia to her schedule next week. Reporting in Green Bay, Emily Byer, Action 2 News.